Now, the geniuses that brought you the destruction of Iraq and Afghanistan repeated their genius in Libya and tried to do so in Syria, but have mercifully failed, though they will not stop trying. In Libya, which was the richest country in Africa, there is now virtually no state at all. The doors have been blown open onto the Mediterranean, and much of Africa is trying at least to head for the European continent, with knock-on effects in the political systems in countries like Greece and Italy and Spain and France, and of course even here in Britain, though precious few of those refugees ever make it to this particular island. The consequences, though, for the Libyan people are far more grim. Libya became, for a time, and I don't think it has entirely ended, a slave market for black people who were literally being traded as slaves. The country broke into effectively 3, maybe 23 different emirates where warlords and their own militias ruled the roost. There are 3 parliaments, and there were at least 4 prime ministers. None of those parliaments controlled the territory beyond their own congestion charge area, and none of these prime ministers has more than a modicum of authority across the country. There is war, war, and war, where the people were promised peace, freedom, and democracy. You'll recall that President Sarkozy and the then Prime Minister David Cameron proclaimed all of that from a balcony in Benghazi. They wouldn't be able to restage that stunt because, well, no one is safe in Benghazi. The former Libyan Minister for Culture and Information became a familiar face and voice in the British media towards the end of the rule of Colonel Gaddafi. He is Dr. موسی Ibrahim, and he joins me on the line now. Dr. Ibrahim, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Mother of All talk shows. It's good to see you safe. I feared for your safety for some time. Give us your take on what's happened to your country this far in the democratic era ushered in by NATO.
Thank you, George. I'm absolutely honored to be with you on this show.
Thank you.
I have been listening to you for more than 20 years, since I was a student in the UK in the late 90s. I have seen you fight the fight against injustice, not just in Britain, which you care for so deeply, as I saw with my own eyes, but injustice everywhere. You have been consistent, you have been honest, and people can go back to any previous decade and see that you have been saying the same things over and over, a very remarkable thing for a modern era politician.
Thank you,
I respect you for that, and the work you do is influential, and it helps people to understand what is going on around the world. My country was a leading African country with a genuine and inspirational African and Libyan liberation project. Gaddafi and the thousands of people who worked with him, I'm only one of them, really planned, funded financially and culturally and politically a project that aimed to establish the African Central Bank, the African Unified Currency, the African Unified Army, the African Unified Satellite System. And these were not just dreams, they were not just talk, but they were actual projects on the ground. And Gaddafi was working very hard to help Africa become independent from the West, from the global capitalist center, which still enslaves the country, as every single piece of research and study proves year after year. Only 2 years ago, a major study, international one, came out that exposed what they call the new scramble for Africa, in which, with figures and numbers, hard economics, they proved that more than 140 billion euros flow out of Africa to European banks with no benefit to the continent. The Europeans were extremely worried about what Libya was leading. They knew that Libya, just as any developing country, had internal problems, conflicts, some failures even, very not natural for a developing country. It had its tribal structure. It had weaknesses on the political front. And they, as usual, they had the money, the West. They had the experts, the intellectuals, the politicians. So they mounted a false revolution, a revolution that was very weak, very limited, very marginalized. The vast majority of the Libyan people refused it. They wanted changes to take place in the country, but they never wanted to destroy their own country or ally themselves with the very forces that kept occupying the country and destroying it for decades and decades since the 19th century, starting from the Italians to the French to the British and the Americans. But the global mainstream media, the tools for global capitalism, such as the UN and the European Union, they gave this revolution the momentum it needed. And within a week, I mean, how could a revolution just take a week before you give it a full international support and air bombardment by NATO 2 weeks later? And the reason was very simple and very straightforward. We knew it from the very beginning. They were afraid, the West, the capital. When I say the West, of course, I do not unify. I mean the capitalist center of global imperialism. They warned us. They talked to us in 2008 and 2009, 2010. I was part of some of these talks, and they warned us about what we were doing in Africa. What happened after that? Total destruction of Libya, the initiation of terrorism in the country, the building up of tribal and Islamist militias, the loss of sovereignty of Libya, the rob of national wealth, like oil especially, complete dependency on the West and the UN, a story very similar to Iraq and was going to be similar to Syria. And the results in Africa are even bigger because all of the projects of liberation have stopped and they were replaced, George, by new imperialist projects. So instead of the African Unified Army, which Gaddafi supported with hard money, now you have the American African Command, and you have the French G5S military force in the west of the continent. And instead of the African Central Bank, which would have saved billions in African currency and African wealth, you have the complete control of the French Central Bank and the London Stock Exchange of the African natural resources. And instead of the African Union developing and becoming more solid, more powerful, now the African Union is a weak, marginalized organization that has no rule in the African continent. And all of this because the base country, Libya, and the leader who took it upon himself to help Africa liberate itself were attacked, were black-named, and their reputation was attacked in a very vicious way. The results of this throughout, what now, 8 years, prove that everything we said and everything we tried to explain about what was happening in Libya was correct. Even the British, and I'm happy to say, this is something good about British politics, there's a complexity, there's a degree of difference and some color. The British Parliamentarian Committee, high-ranking, high-level, very well-funded, that worked for 2 years to examine the British intervention in Libya, came out with one major conclusion, that all of the accusations and justifications for the attack against Libya in 2011 were either completely fabricated or at least greatly exaggerated to mount this war against my country.
Well, that's as powerful an opening series of shots as we've ever heard here on the Mother of All Talk Shows, and I'm grateful to you for it. That was truly a tour de force that will live, I think, in the ether, in the atmosphere, in the internet for a very long time to come. So thank you for that. One of the many powerful points that you made was the extraordinary phenomenon of the Western news media literally cheering on exactly the same kind of Islamist fanatic head choppers in Libya that they would be determined to shoot down dead in the streets here in our own country. We ourselves, and I was just less than 1 mile away when the Islamist fanatic Libyan British citizen, facilitated by the British state, rescued by the Royal Navy, given succor and comfort by the British state over many years, he and his small community, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the clue being in the name. I was less than 1 mile away when he blew himself and all those little children dead apart, ripped them apart in the Manchester arena. So it's difficult for me not to get angry as I recall the phenomenon that you describe. Let me ask you, to what extent is Libya's current division a division that is tribally based? And to what extent is it based on interpretations of Islamism? Are there theological, ideological divisions between all these warlords? Or do they just wear their Islam on their sleeve to justify their own warlordism?
Well, George, it's a game that the British and Europeans in general have perfected since first initiating it in the 19th century, which is basically to come to a particularly stable context that they want to rob. So what they do, they introduce some sort of a crisis based on the internal condition of this political context. And of course, to do that, you have to study the country you want to rob. And that is why then you come into the use of intelligentsia and the use of academic research, intellectuals, clever people who would tell you how this particular context is vulnerable in this particular way. Think of India, think of South Africa, think of North Africa, think of South America. And for Libya, they studied the Libyan context, and they understood that although it's a very stable, very rich, very prospering country, but as any nation in the world, it has its internal vulnerabilities. So it has a tribal system that has worked well for decades. And it has the religion of Islam with its connotations with terrorism. And it has the oil wealth. And when you have a revenue-based economy, you have some sort of not very productive or participatory relationship to the economy as a citizen, but reliance on oil, and this is a weakness. There is also the placement of Libya within the Arab and African contexts, also weak and vulnerable in other ways. So the Europeans worked on this. For years, we were aware of some of this work, even before 2011. And when they came, they used the same Islamist threat. The British are very versed in Islamic terrorism. They initiated it decades, even from the 19th century in the Indian situation. And they knew the leaders of terrorism by name. Not just that, but it's a very well-known fact. This is not a revelation I'm giving to your audience. When the biggest and most dangerous Islamist terrorists came back victorious, of course, from Afghanistan, very well trained, very well funded, and feeling like with their spirits high because they defeated the Soviet Union, where did they go? Did they come back to Libya or to Saudi Arabia or to Syria? No, they went to Manchester, they went to Newcastle, they went to London, and they opened up mosques or dominated the already existing mosques. Arab countries, whether they are progressive countries like Libya, Syria, Algeria, or reactionary countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they have been demanding that Britain abandons these terrorists and give them up. But Britain never did, because it knew at that time that it had a powerful weapon that it could unleash against any government in the Middle East. And they did that indeed with great success in Iraq. They did that with success to start with, but then a failure in Syria, in Libya. All of the big names of Islamic terrorism, Abd al-Hakim Bilhaj, Ali al-Sallabi, Sliman al-Abedi, Abu Yahya al-Libi, all of these major figures with money, with training, with followers, all of them were based in Manchester, Newcastle, Liverpool, and other great British cities. So now they are being used within the tribal framework, because Libya, to get things going, you have to get the families and the clans and the tribes moving with you. Most of the tribal social framework is coherent and patriotic and refuses to collaborate. But as you know, George, to destroy a country, you only need 2 to 3% of that country collaborating with you. If you have you had like one terrorist attacking the public in Manchester, and the horror is too much to take. Imagine if there are 10,000. That's a minute figure, but 10,000 terrorists in a country like Britain, they will make life impossible. And this is what happened in Libya. They have these thousands of terrorists collaborating with a small, limited number of tribal clans or families, supported and funded greatly by France, Turkey, Britain, and Italy, especially, more than, for example, the States. The States is less involved for its own reasons. And then what you want them to do is just to spread chaos. And then what you do, you manage this chaos. You manage it so it does not hit you back, or if it does hit you back, it hits you back in a way that you can bear it, that your system, your powerful capitalist developed system can take it in. And why do you do that? For many reasons. One of them, to keep Libya or any other context weak and unable to become independent or spread revolution, genuine revolution this time, in a bigger context like the African one. And secondly, to plant terror and horror in other countries and other genuine leaders who can ever or could ever think about becoming independent from the West. And also to test the ground for new political systems that would finally submit to the West. So the West now is not sure what government to support in Libya, what faction of society. They want to prolong the crisis so they can rob the oil for more years, so they can sell more weapons as they do. They do that in Saudi Arabia, they do this in Libya, secretly, of course, in Libya, because it's banned by the UN. And they test the waters for what kind of political system, what kind of culture they should finally support and make victorious, so they guarantee that a lasting heritage of dependency, of subordination takes place in the country and becomes the heritage and the culture of that country, instead of Gaddafi's heritage, which is a heritage of revolution, of resistance, of liberation.
This interview will live long in the memory, as I say, certainly in mine. I'm sure I speak for the audience. One final question, Doctor. Can Libya survive all of this? Can Libya come back? Are people like you now in the political museum? Or can you again play a part in change, progressive change in your country?
Absolutely. We are in the heart of every matter in Libya. I assure you, George, I know this can be a little bit hard to see from outside, but the vast majority, and when I say the vast, I mean more than 80–90% of the population are unified against the Western imperialist project in the country. There are internal divisions and some differences. But for example, now the Libyan army, the Libyan armed forces, they have gathered most of the tribes in the country, in the east, in the south, and most of the tribes in the west. The only pockets that are controlled by the West are in the capital and 2 or 3 other cities around it. And they only resist the advance of the Libyan armed forces supported by most Libyan tribes because of the heavy funding and the arms, the advanced arms that are given to them by mainly Turkey, Italy, and France, with major diplomatic support, not weapons, but diplomatic and financial support from the UK. We are now in 2019 stronger. We are much more optimistic. Our spirits are very high. The culture of liberation, the heritage of the Green Revolution of Libya, Gaddafi's revolution, lives on. The West, they know that. They started a year ago negotiating with us, talking directly to us. I have met many of the leaders of the European Union and European politicians face to face, and they always say it, that they know that Libya is gonna go back to the culture of liberation, to the ideas of Gaddafi. They just want to have some sort of an agreement with us so we do not go back to our African liberation project. They are extremely, George, concerned that if their robbing of African natural resources stops, this will be the biggest crisis that Europe will face for a long time. So I assure you, resistance is there, and we are winning the battle. We are winning the hearts and minds of our people, and we are advancing step by step and building up our new Libya, and we will be victorious, and we will come here and talk about it one day, George.
God willing, I could hear a cheer breaking out across the audience, across the world, for that wonderful final statement. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Mosi Ibrahim. May God go with you and protect you. Let's take a quick break.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.